This is my chance to have, we scheduled as a coffee time to have a little one-on-one conversation to flesh out some of these issues. I'm Christopher Robertson. I'm a professor and associate dean at Boston University School of Law. I've been a member of the NYU working group for several years, and I'm delighted to be here as your interviewer. We're really fortunate to have Dr. Peter Marks, who's the director of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, also known as CBER, at the Food and Drug Administration. This center, as many of you know, but is responsible for assuring the safety and effectiveness of biological products, including vaccines, allergenic products, blood and blood products, cellular tissue, and gene therapy. So a lot of the cutting edge sorts of products that impinge on expanded access. So we have full bio sketches available on our website, of course, but let me just mention one essential fact here is that Dr. Marks received his graduate degree in cell and molecular biology and his medical degree at New York University. So on behalf of Art and Allison and all the others on the NYU Team Violet, let me welcome you back to your alma mater, at least virtually, Dr. Marks.
Thanks very much.
I had to look up the mascot of NYU. It's apparently either the violet, the color is itself the mascot, or maybe the bobcat. I don't know. Is there one that you affiliate with more? Do you see yourself more as a violet or a bobcat?
I think it's probably a violet. In fact, I think what I mainly remember is we were told not to wear anything good to graduation in Washington Square because if it rained, the purple gowns bled onto your clothing. I think it's violet.
Okay. Well, to get a little more serious, let me just ask the big question to you is to really segue from our last panel. What do you think of when you think of evidence? What is evidence, and can you derive it from expanded access?
Yeah. So I think evidence, as we take it, is anything that is, I think, systematically collected in an orderly fashion. And so I truly believe that you can derive evidence from expanded access if you set out to collect the evidence in a systematic fashion. In other words, it can be troubling if you just try to do things anecdotally. On the other hand, if one sets out, even sometimes retrospectively, in an orderly fashion to collect information on how people have done with an expanded access program, you can collect a lot of information, and particularly for small populations, it can actually get you over the finish line. And in fact, expanded access programs have gotten a few products over the finish line that otherwise would not have gotten there, just simply because it's just so hard. Think of, for instance, if you have an agent that rescues a drug toxicity that's relatively rare, it may be very hard to do a clinical trial because you just can't get that out there. You can't have enough sites open. Whereas when you have an expanded access program, someone needs it, you get it out there in an emergency manner, collecting those data can be very helpful. So I think it's possible. And it's actually in some ways one of those types of real world evidence, just on a small scale, as opposed to the other direction where we sometimes go, where it's a large scale.
Well, thank you. Let me follow. You talked about how you can collect more robust and more rigorous data from the expanded access process, but can you talk a little bit about the tension with burdening clinicians and how can we square that circle to make sure that the collection of data isn't actually undermining either the clinical work itself or the clinician's time?
Well, first of all, many times for these expanded access programs, we're dealing with serious illnesses where the outcomes are pretty clear. And so the data that needs to be collected may already be captured in systems. Now, in the olden days, in ones that are very familiar to me, we had paper charts, but now oftentimes it's the electronic medical record. And in some cases, it may be that one does not need to actually ask the clinician to capture anything more specific than some of the standards of care that they would normally capture. I guess it could be nice. Could you get a little bit more? Yeah, in some cases that would be nice. But in some cases, it's a matter of looking at days of hospitalization, days on dialysis, days free of being on a ventilator, things like this that are able to be captured using either claims databases, medical records. So I think I agree. The issue here is we don't want to have to burden. The whole point of this is not to burden clinicians with doing clinical research that they're getting that's uncompensated clinical research, essentially. On the other hand, there are ways when you're doing things for diseases that are serious that hopefully they're being captured electronically now.
Well, let me turn us a little bit towards the pandemic, right? It's nice to have a conversation where we go 10 minutes without someone saying COVID-19, but here we are. And given your role in particular and the importance of biological products through the pandemic, let me just start with how did you approach the question of expanded access versus, say, emergency use authorization in thinking about these urgent needs for investigational products?
Right. So this is a really good question. And it had to do, for instance, for convalescent plasma, to use an example, with how much data we actually had to be able to do something. Well, let's just give you an example of what led to the expanded access program early on in the pandemic for convalescent plasma. It was that there were enough data that had come out of China and anecdotal reports from other places that people were starting to use convalescent plasma pretty widely. And in New York State, they started to use hundreds of units a day, which meant that we had hundreds of individual patient emergency IND requests. And that was not sustainable. So ultimately, we ended up realizing, well, we can really continue to get overwhelmed with these, or we could actually work together. In this case, it was a collaboration of Mayo and Johns Hopkins that came in with support from the Biomedical Advanced Research Development Authority from HHS to put together an expanded access program that actually did collect some data on individuals with the hope that we would actually be able to figure out whether the intervention was working, and that at least we would ensure that it was being used safely. So that for that particular piece where there wasn't a lot of information, fit for purpose was an expanded access program. It was quite a large one. It was larger than we ever imagined it would get, and that we could have another discussion about that and how it got that way. But I think that was just another one of those things that happened during pandemic that we perhaps didn't anticipate, and that we'll know for future. Now, for emergency use authorization, there we've tried to have a somewhat higher bar, not quite our approval standard, but a bar that would make people who would normally be nervous about participating in clinical research feel comfortable, right? We don't want them to have to sign, they don't sign a consent form. And so there, for therapeutics, we wanted to have good evidence from trials, maybe not the same that we would need for licensure of biologic. And for vaccines, we set that bar even higher because for vaccines given to healthy people, most people want to know that the thing's going to probably work and it's not going to cause them harm. And so we did set the bar differently here. And I think it actually worked out okay. It's kind of a spectrum, perhaps, here. And some people have said, well, why didn't you do an expanded access program very early on for the vaccines? And the answer was that, well, for the vaccines, because they were done, the studies were these massive clinical trials. By the time we had the kind of evidence that they really were effective, they were pretty much ready for emergency use authorization. So that's what led to some of that distinction between the expanded access program for convalescent plasma and what we did with proceeding directly to an emergency use authorization for the vaccines.
Now, when I set up that question, I set it up as a bit of a false dilemma between expanded access or emergency use authorization. I mean, it's the nature of trying to be concise and sharpen the conversation. But I want to bring in the third thing, which is really clinical trials, right? And maybe the convalescent plasma is a good example of that I want to ask you about is how did you weigh the worry about diverting patients out of clinical trials where we could do more than real world evidence, actually have randomization and pre-specified outcomes and things like that? Did you start to become concerned as these EA programs ballooned into huge numbers?
Yeah, so that is a great question, and we thought a lot. Our original idea before we went to an expanded access program was, could we get large randomized trials going on? But we also there's a little there's something that sometimes happens, that we go through a traumatic experience and then we lose memory of it. I don't know, maybe we all need to remember what it was like in March of 2020, but the healthcare system was in disarray. It was very hard to get anyone to get together in a large randomized clinical trial. We worked with a few different medical centers, and it became clear that there would be at least 2 to 3 months before that such a trial would be able to get up and running. And if you look at when some of the active collaboration trials got up and running, that's how it took. It took a while to get those going. So I totally agree that it would have been preferable to have large randomized clinical trials going. It was, though, a time when the healthcare system was just unable to organize around getting those going fast enough. And that's something we can discuss another day. Why I think hopefully for the next one of these, we'll be ready to ramp up more quickly. But it just didn't. And the expanded access allowed this to happen in a way that didn't require interactive, randomization schemes. It didn't require large scale CRFs. It didn't require investigator payments. It didn't, in the kind of ways that one would need to set up with contracts. So it allowed that to move much more quickly. Should we probably, I'm the first one to say, should we probably have not let it burgeon out to where it did so quickly? I think we probably should have tried to push this more towards randomized trials more quickly, but it is something that happens. So it went from a modestly large-sized program to a massive program within a month's time. And so we know now for the future.
Let me go to a larger theme of what we can learn from the pandemic about access to investigational products. But maybe the pivot of that would be, do you think the pandemic has taught us something about our capacity, is it a capacity or is it more about a preference to actually run large scale randomized trials more routinely? 4 or 5 years ago, there was a lot of talk. In fact, there were some op-eds written by the FDA commissioner about larger platform trials and, the way Google does A/B randomization and every ad you see. And can we start building, randomization and large-scale rigorous evidence just into the way we do medicine? Do you think we've learned anything from the pandemic that either makes that more or less likely or feasible?
Yeah, great question. I do think we have, which is that I think we've learned that that there are types of trials that can be done during a pandemic that are more optimal than others. And that means the ones that are done, and I think recovery is a great example of that. You keep it simple, and you enroll lots of patients, try to make it as real as you can. We try to move forward towards that. I think in the future, it's really critical that we move as quickly as we can into running things on trials and get those trials up and running using the best thoughtfulness we can in getting these trials up and running, because some of the trials that got up and running very quickly, in the end, have their flaws, but you can fault them for their flaws, or you can laud them for the fact that they at least got answers that helped move things forward. I think to the extent that you want to kind of find a happy medium of try to think through this well, get reasonably streamlined trials designed, and get people randomized to them in a pandemic, that would be very, very helpful. So yeah, I'm hoping for the next time we will have a playbook perhaps that will let us get there more quickly. Because if we don't come out of this pandemic with some playbooks for the next time this happens, this will have been, we will have lost an opportunity.
And do you think the FDA has a role, either under current statutes, or could you imagine a role for the FDA to coordinate that production of knowledge more systematically through creating templates or working groups, consortia? I know Critical Path Institute does some of this sort of thing, but how can we normalize this evidence generation activity?
I think we have a role in collaboration with NIH, CDC. I think the public health agencies can work together. We can help provide a good sense of what type of evidence is required to get things over the finish line. We can help provide a good idea of what endpoints make sense, how you can streamline endpoints. I think NIH obviously has a lot of expertise in clinical trial design, CDC, and how you collect data and you do things in the real world. So I think you leverage the best that each of the public health agencies have to offer, and hopefully bring it all together and be able to move things forward.
But let me just ask one last question about the global perspective and how other countries, or how the U.S. coordinated with other countries to address access in the pre-approval context.
Yeah, great question. We've had conversations with other countries. We knew what other countries were doing. Some of the issue here is that different countries have different ways of providing pre-approval access, some of which are not actually based on science. We were based on political decisions that were made. And so that has been a challenge, obviously. And I think that's actually something for further discussion moving forward, hopefully between governments, that some of the awkwardness early on in the pandemic were that there were vaccine approvals in some locations in the absence of data. And in some cases that turned out like a good bet. In other cases, it didn't turn out like such a good bet. So I think we do live in a global environment, and to the extent that we can coordinate and collaborate with our colleagues in other countries, it's very helpful. In this pandemic, we knew what was going on, but we didn't have a big hand in what was going on in other countries.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Marks.